The doors of the mess hall opened with a low creak as the human stepped inside, clutching an empty tray in her hands. The air was filled with the clatter of utensils, the murmur of conversations, and the aroma of warm food, but all of that seemed to fade the moment she entered. Heads turned slightly, voices lowered, and though no one spoke directly to her, the silence carried its own weight. She walked forward slowly, her steps careful, as if every movement might disturb the fragile peace in the room. The aliens sat in groups, their faces lit with laughter and easy chatter, but none of that warmth was meant for her. She had grown used to this reception, yet each day it still left a heavy mark on her heart. She joined the line, holding her tray tightly against her chest, and waited as others ahead of her collected their meals. When it was her turn, the server paused, glanced at her, and then without a word moved on to the next person. Her tray remained empty. She wanted to speak, to ask why, but her voice stayed trapped inside. She could feel the eyes behind her, impatient, curious, and maybe even amused. The moment stretched, and finally she stepped aside, her face calm but her heart sinking lower. She walked across the hall, passing rows of tables filled with food and laughter, until she reached a lonely corner. Sitting down, she placed the empty tray in front of her and straightened her back, as though nothing was wrong. But inside, it was different. Hunger was not new to her. She had known it before, survived it before. But it was the quiet rejection, the reminder that she did not belong, that hurt more than the ache in her stomach. She lowered her gaze to avoid meeting anyone's eyes, though she knew they were watching. She tried to focus on the sound of her own breath, steadying it, refusing to let the sting of humiliation break her. The tray remained bare, a clear sign to everyone who glanced her way, but she pretended it didn't matter. Still, a question lingered in her heart. Why did they hate her presence so much? She had done her best, worked harder than most, and showed respect whenever she could. Yet she was always set apart, as though her humanity was something shameful. She told herself to be strong, that strength meant silence sometimes. But even strength felt lonely when surrounded by walls of indifference. Across the room, some turned back to their meals, but others kept sneaking glances, whispering behind their hands. She could not hear the words, but she felt their weight. She pulled her hands into her lap and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to swallow the tightness in her throat. It would pass, she told herself, just like every other day. But even as she reminded herself, she knew this moment was different. Something about the silence in the room, the way it hung heavier than usual, made it clear that this day would not end like all the others. And so she sat, a human among those who refused to see her as one of them, her tray empty, her spirit tested. Though no one came to her side yet, unseen eyes were watching from a distance, small, innocent eyes that remembered kindness when the world had none to give. Something was about to change, though she did not know it yet. The line in the mess hall moved slowly, trays sliding across the counter as steaming bowls were handed out one by one. The human stood quietly, waiting for her turn, trying to keep her breathing calm. She told herself it would be just another meal, just another moment to endure. When the person in front of her stepped away with a full tray, she moved forward, setting her empty one down with hope, even if it was a fragile kind. The server looked at her, hesitated for the briefest second, and then, without a word, shifted their hand away. The ladle that had been ready for her was lowered, and they passed right over her tray as if she wasn't there. Her chest tightened, though her face stayed still. She whispered softly, "Please." But the word barely reached the counter. The server's eyes avoided hers, moving instead to the next in line. The person behind her stepped forward eagerly, their plate filled without pause. She stood there for a moment too long, her hands pressed against the edge of the counter, as whispers began to move through the air like quiet smoke. She could feel them, low and cutting, though she could not make out every word. Some were mocking, some curious, but all carried the same message. She was different. She was not wanted. Her throat felt dry, and though hunger gnawed at her stomach, it was the sharp sting of being denied so openly that hurt the most. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the floor, but she knew that walking away with nothing would draw even more attention. She picked up her empty tray slowly, as if it weighed more than she could carry, and stepped aside. A faint smirk caught her eye from one of the tables, a look that said they had been waiting for this, and the humiliation pressed down harder than hunger ever could. She found her corner again, the same seat she always chose, and placed the tray in front of her. It looked even more bare than before, a silent reminder of the cruelty she had just faced. She tried to sit tall, tried not to let her shoulders curl inward, but her chest ached with the effort of holding it all in. The sounds of laughter and clinking spoons filled the hall, but around her there was only emptiness. She lowered her eyes, pretending to study the tray, though the truth was she was fighting back the heaviness building behind her eyes. A thought crossed her mind. Food was only part of survival. Dignity mattered just as much, and hers had been stripped in front of everyone. She remembered moments when she had stood up for others, when she had offered help to those who were small or weak. But now in this hall no one seemed willing to stand for her. The ache in her chest grew sharper as she realized how alone she really was. Still, she refused to let them see her break. She pressed her hands together tightly under the table, willing herself to stay calm, to stay steady. Her silence was her shield, though it cost her more than words ever could. The whispers continued in waves, some glances shot her way, and yet she sat there unmoving, as if rooted by sheer will. She told herself she would endure, she always did. But deep inside, she could not shake the feeling that this moment, this denial, was different, because it had been seen by eyes that remembered her kindness, eyes too young to understand cruelty, but wise enough to act against it when the time came. She carried her tray across the room slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, though there was nothing on it. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the mess hall, but none of it touched her. She found her usual seat in the far corner, the one no one else ever chose, and slid into it quietly, keeping her head down. She placed the empty tray in front of her, pretending as if it didn't matter, as if she had no need for food at all. She folded her hands on her lap, sat straight, and tried to look calm, but the tray stood there like a cruel reminder of what had just happened. Every glance that passed her way seemed sharper because of it. Her stomach growled softly, a low ache that reminded her she had not eaten since morning. But the hunger was not what hurt the most. Hunger was something she could endure. She had endured it before. What burned far deeper was the rejection, the fact that in a hall full of life, she was treated as if she did not belong, as if she was less than the others. She lifted her eyes briefly and caught sight of a group at a nearby table laughing, and though they were not looking directly at her, the sound felt like it was aimed at the emptiness in front of her. She looked back down quickly, trying to shield herself from the sting. Inside her chest, a tightness built, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, in and out, the way she always did when things grew too heavy. She told herself that silence was strength, that if she sat still and refused to let them see her pain, she would win in her own quiet way. But it was hard, so very hard, when her hands trembled slightly under the table, hidden from sight. She pressed them together to steady herself, whispering in her mind that this would pass, that she only needed to endure a little longer. The tray, however, betrayed her. It was there, plain and bare, speaking louder than words ever could. Anyone who looked her way could see the truth, that she had been denied, that she was unwanted. She felt exposed, as though her shame had been placed on display for everyone to judge. Still, she kept her face still, her eyes lowered, pretending not to care. The mask was all she had. From time to time, she risked a glance toward the doors, imagining what it would feel like to simply walk out, to escape the room and its stares. But she knew leaving would mean admitting defeat, giving them the satisfaction of seeing her run. She could not allow that, not today. So she remained seated, steady as stone, even as the noise of spoons and voices grew louder around her. Somewhere in the hall, she felt eyes on her, not the cold, mocking ones, but softer, smaller ones that lingered longer. She did not turn her head, but she could sense it, as though someone was quietly studying her. She didn't know who it was, didn't know that her quiet endurance was being marked and remembered. For now, all she knew was the battle within. Hunger twisting in her stomach, rejection pressing against her chest, and silence standing as her only shield. She told herself she would last until the end of the meal. She always did. But deep inside, she wondered how many more times her spirit could carry this same weight before it broke. In the far corner of the mess hall, away from the noise of clinking bowls and loud chatter, a group of young alien cubs sat together, their small frames almost hidden by the high benches. They were eating quietly, their eyes not on their own plates, but on the lonely figure sitting apart from the others. The human sat in her usual place, an empty tray before her, her shoulders straight as though she was trying to appear strong, though the cubs could sense the sadness she carried. They had seen this before. It was not the first time she had been treated this way, but today something about it seemed sharper, more cruel, and they could not take their eyes off her. The cubs remembered things that many of the older ones had forgotten or chosen to ignore. They remembered the way she had once stepped in when they were being mocked for being too small, standing firmly between them and those who tried to push them around. They remembered her gentle voice when she spoke to them, never harsh, never dismissive, always with a patience that made them feel seen. There had been times when she had shared what little she had, slipping a piece of her own food onto their plates when they were still hungry. To them, she was not strange or different. She was someone who had shown kindness when no one else did. Now, watching her sit with nothing, their young hearts felt restless. They did not understand all the reasons why the others treated her this way, but they understood unfairness when they saw it. They whispered softly among themselves, their large eyes darting from her tray back to their own plates, full with food she had been denied. One cub clenched his little hands, as if struggling with a thought too big for him, while another lowered her spoon slowly, no longer able to enjoy her meal while the human sat with nothing. The hall was still noisy, but for the cubs, the sounds faded into the background. All they could hear was the quiet ache of their own hearts as they remembered the times she had defended them. One memory in particular stood out to them. The day she had stood at the training yard, shielding them from harsh words that had been thrown like stones. That day, she had taken the blame so they would not be punished, and though she had walked away alone, the cubs had never forgotten. Now, as they looked at her empty tray, they knew they were faced with a choice. They were small, and their voices might not carry weight in the hall, but their actions could. They shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances filled with meaning far beyond their years. Something inside them stirred, a mixture of loyalty and courage, the kind that only came when kindness was returned with loyalty. The cubs did not speak to her, not yet, but their silence was not like the silence of the others. Their silence was filled with thought, with memory, with quiet plans forming in their hearts. They did not see her as an outsider the way the others did. They saw her as someone who had once stood for them when no one else would, and now, in this moment, their small eyes watched with an unspoken promise. They would not let her sit in hunger forever. Something was about to change, and they were the ones who would make the first move. The cub sat for a long moment, his small hands curled around his spoon, his mind racing faster than his heartbeat. He glanced at the others around him, their eyes filled with the same mix of worry and loyalty, but none of them moved. The human sat alone across the hall, her tray still empty, her back straight as if holding herself together with invisible threads. He could see the way her eyes lingered on the food others carried, not with anger, but with quiet endurance. That was when something inside him shifted. Without speaking, he pushed his plate forward and slid off the bench, the sound of his claws tapping softly against the floor as he made his way across the wide hall. The moment he rose, a few heads turned, curious but dismissive, expecting him to be running to fetch something or to return late to his group. But as he walked past the rows of tables, his small figure seemed to draw more attention. The hall, once filled with laughter and chatter, slowly began to quiet, one voice dropping after another until silence rippled outward like a wave. All eyes followed his steps, wondering where he was going and why his plate was still in his hands. When he reached her table, the human looked up, surprise flashing across her tired face. She had been expecting more stares, maybe another cruel word, but never this. The cub did not speak, his throat tight with nerves, but his actions carried more weight than words could. Carefully, with both hands, he lifted his plate and set it down onto her empty tray. The sound of it landing was soft, but in the silence of the hall, it seemed louder than anything. The human blinked, unsure how to respond. For a moment, she thought perhaps he had made a mistake, but the way he looked at her, serious, steady, unshaken, told her it was no accident. Her chest tightened. The sting of rejection that had burned in her moments ago now replaced with something unfamiliar, something that felt almost like hope. She wanted to tell him not to keep his food, but the words caught in her throat. Around them, whispers began to rise. Confusion spread, and some older ones frowned, clearly disapproving, but none dared to interrupt. The sight was too unexpected, too powerful. A cub, one of their own young, standing silently beside the human with a gesture that carried more defiance than any shout ever could. The boy did not wait for thanks. He did not bow nor explain himself. Instead, he simply gave her a final look, as if reminding her of the kindness she had once shown him, and then stepped back. His small act had broken through the wall of silence and cruelty that had been built around her, and though he was only one, he had become the first to cross it. The human stared at the plate in front of her, her eyes stinging in a way she had not felt for a long time. She touched the edge of the tray lightly, her voice still trapped inside her chest, but her heart stirred with emotions she could barely contain. She had come into the hall expecting nothing but hunger and humiliation, but now, with one quiet act of courage, everything had begun to change. The silence in the hall had grown so heavy that every small sound seemed louder than it should be. The first cub's quiet action lingered in the air like a challenge no one expected. The human stared at the plate in front of her, still unsure if she should touch it, afraid it might somehow draw more attention. But before she could even gather her thoughts, another cub pushed away from his seat. His steps were hesitant, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. Holding his portion tightly in his small hands, he walked across the room. The crowd followed his every move, their whispers sharp but low, unsure if what they were seeing was bravery or foolishness. He stopped at her table, placed his food beside the first plate, and then stood silently, his expression firm despite the trembling in his fingers. Gasps echoed faintly through the hall, and this time the effect was stronger. If one cub's act had been strange, two made it undeniable. The message was clear. They were not going to sit and watch her suffer while they ate. A third cub stood up, then a fourth. Their steps grew quicker, bolder, as though each one drew courage from the one before. Soon more plates began to leave their owner's hands, making their way across the room toward her lonely table. Each portion was placed gently in front of her, no words spoken, yet the meaning louder than anything shouted. The human's eyes widened with every new gesture. Her tray, once painfully empty, now filled with food she had not even asked for. She pressed her lips together, trying to steady the flood of emotions rushing through her. The sting of humiliation that had carved deep inside her chest was now being replaced with something warmer, something that made her throat tighten and her hands shake. She had never expected kindness, certainly not here. But these young ones, these small cubs, were rewriting the moment in front of everyone. Around the hall, older voices began to murmur disapprovingly, but no one stepped forward to stop it. The sight itself was too powerful to break. The cubs, standing united around her table, became a wall of silent defiance. They did not shout, they did not argue, but their actions carried a strength no punishment could erase. In their eyes, this was not rebellion, it was loyalty. They remembered the times when she had stood with them, when others mocked them for being small, when she had defended them without hesitation. Now it was their turn, and they would not abandon her when she needed them most. The human lowered her gaze, her breath uneven, her hands brushing lightly against the food now covering her tray. She wanted to thank them, to tell them how much this meant, but her voice refused to come out. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. She had walked into the mess hall carrying nothing but shame and an empty tray, yet now, surrounded by small hands that refused to let her fall, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. The mess hall remained silent. Every adult and elder watching, some with disbelief, others with quiet admiration they dared not show. What began as one cub's single step had grown into a movement none of them could ignore. And as the cubs stood firm around her, their plates sacrificed for her dignity, the human realized she was no longer sitting alone. She had been claimed not by pity but by loyalty, and that truth was stronger than any cruelty the hall could offer. The mess hall had never been this silent. Every sound, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a spoon, echoed like thunder in the stillness. The human sat frozen, staring at the food on her tray, while the cubs stood beside her like a small but unshakable guard. Shock rippled through the room like a wave, reaching every table, every corner, every set of eyes. No one had expected this. A few turned their heads away, unable to meet her gaze, as though her quiet suffering had suddenly become a mirror, reflecting their own silence. Others shifted in their seats, their hands tightening around utensils or cups, pretending to be busy while sneaking glances at the scene they could not ignore. For some, shame pressed down heavier than hunger. They had watched her be humiliated, they had heard the refusal at the counter, and yet they had done nothing. Their hearts ached with a guilt they tried to bury. But the cubs' simple act of kindness tore through every excuse they had built. If children could see the wrong and act, what did that say about the adults who had remained still? The thought left many restless, their shoulders slumping as if the weight of silence itself had grown too much to carry. But not all shared the same feeling. A few looked on with narrowed eyes, their lips pressed tight in disapproval. They whispered among themselves, trying to dismiss the gesture as foolish or reckless. Yet even they could not deny the power of what had just happened. The cubs had challenged the unspoken rule, and the entire hall now stood as witness. Some fidgeted nervously, as if waiting for someone in authority to intervene, but no one moved. The air was too thick, the moment too raw. The human felt every eye on her, but the silence was not the same as before. Earlier it had been cold and isolating, a reminder that she did not belong. Now it was heavy with something different. Recognition, reflection, maybe even respect. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure others could hear it. She had never asked for this attention, yet here it was, unescapable, reshaping the air around her. The cubs remained firm, their small bodies lined beside her table. Their faces carried no fear, only quiet certainty. In their presence, the silence became almost unbearable for the rest of the hall. Some lowered their heads, ashamed to look at them. Others sat stiffly, as if unsure whether to applaud, protest, or remain still. And in the center of it all, the human sat with trembling hands, caught between gratitude and disbelief, her heart aching at the kindness that had been shown. It was a moment that could not be undone. The silence, though wordless, spoke louder than anything said aloud. It carried questions that lingered in every mind. Why had she been treated this way? Why had no one spoken up sooner? And how had these cubs, the youngest among them all, found the courage that so many older ones lacked? No answer came, only silence heavier than stone, pressing on the shoulders of everyone in the room. Yet within that silence lay the beginning of change, fragile but undeniable. The hall had witnessed something extraordinary. And though not a single word had been spoken, nothing would ever feel the same again. Her hands shook slightly as she looked at the tray in front of her, now filled with food she had not been given, but instead offered by the cubs who stood loyally beside her. For a moment she could not bring herself to move, afraid that if she blinked, the food, the cubs, the kindness, they might all disappear like a fragile dream. Her eyes blurred as tears gathered, not from the hunger that had weighed on her all day, but from the overwhelming warmth of being seen, of being defended when she had expected only silence. She lifted her gaze to the small faces around her, their wide eyes steady, their postures strong despite their size. They had done this for her, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Her lips trembled as she whispered her thanks, the words soft and almost broken. The sound was barely audible in the heavy stillness of the hall, but the cubs heard it, and their eyes softened in response. Gratitude carried through her voice, so raw and real that it pressed against the hearts of those watching. It was not a grand speech, Not a loud declaration, just a whisper of thanks, but it carried more weight than any speech could. In that simple moment, the human's gratitude turned the cub's quiet rebellion into something even more powerful. She lowered her head slightly, trying to steady herself, trying to hold back the flood of emotions rising inside. The kindness had caught her unprepared, breaking the wall of silence and endurance she had built around herself. For so long she had taught herself to take every cold glance, every unkind word, every small rejection, without letting her spirit show its cracks. But now, faced with such unselfish kindness, her spirit could no longer hide. The tears slipped down her cheeks, silent but shining, carrying with them both the ache of the past and the warmth of this unexpected moment. The cubs did not speak, but they didn't need to. Their presence beside her was enough. She could feel their loyalty, their small shoulders squared against a hall full of eyes, their simple act of sharing becoming a shield stronger than any words could build. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone. She reached out with careful hands, touching the edge of her tray as if to steady herself, and gave a small nod to each cub, her way of saying that their gesture had not just filled her tray, but her heart. Around the hall, people shifted uneasily, their own emotions stirred by the sight. Some were moved, realizing how deep the human's gratitude ran, how much weight a whisper of thanks could hold when spoken with honesty. Others struggled with guilt, remembering their own silence earlier, when they could have stood up for her, but did not. But no one could deny the truth unfolding in front of them, that compassion had power, and gratitude could turn a simple act into something unforgettable. As she sat there, the human felt her hunger still pressing, but it was no longer the only thing she carried. Her heart was warmed, her spirit lifted, and her voice, though trembling, had broken through the silence with quiet gratitude. It was a moment etched deeply into her soul, one she knew she would carry with her always, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change everything. The leaders seated at the far end of the hall had watched the scene unfold in silence, their eyes narrowing as each cub placed food onto the human's tray. At first they thought it was nothing more than a childish gesture, a small act of rebellion that would soon be forgotten. But as the room grew still, as whispers died and shame filled the air, they began to understand the depth of what had just taken place. Without a single word, the cubs had delivered a lesson more powerful than any command or speech could ever give. They had shown everyone that respect could not be forced, and loyalty could not be demanded. It had to be earned through actions, through kindness, through truth. The leaders exchanged uneasy glances, each of them wrestling with thoughts they rarely allowed to surface. They had built their authority on power, on rules, on making others obey. But here, in front of their eyes, a group of young cubs had changed the balance of the entire room. The human, once treated as an outsider, now sat surrounded by loyalty freely given. No one had ordered it. No one had forced it. It had come from the cubs' hearts, and that made it unshakable. The leaders could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on them, a reminder that fear could never inspire the same devotion as respect. Around them, the rest of the hall sat in silence, struggling with their own realizations. Some lowered their heads, unable to face the quiet courage of the cubs. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of surprise, guilt, and thoughtfulness. The human's gratitude, the cubs' bravery, and the silence that followed had turned an ordinary meal into a lesson for everyone present. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about dignity, about kindness, about what it truly meant to stand by someone who had been left alone. The leaders shifted in their seats, the weight of the moment refusing to leave. They could sense the change taking root among the people, a change that no order from them could erase. The cubs had unknowingly challenged not just the cruelty of the moment, but the very idea that some lives mattered less than others. They had done it without speeches, without force, with nothing more than quiet loyalty, and that was why it struck so deeply. The human, though silent, became the center of that lesson. Her quiet tears, her whispered thanks, and the way she held herself with dignity even when humiliated had already spoken volumes. And now, paired with the cub's loyalty, her presence became something more, a mirror reflecting back at everyone the kind of world they were shaping with their choices. No one said it aloud, but every leader and every onlooker knew the truth. The cubs had done what the adults had failed to do. They had defended what was right. They had shown that respect was never about status or power. It was about humanity, about standing by another soul simply because it was the right thing to do. And in that moment, as the heavy silence lingered, the hall became more than just a place to eat. It became a place where everyone present learned a lesson they would carry with them long after the plates were cleared. From that day on, the mess hall was never the same. The memory of that moment clung to the walls, whispered in conversations, and lived in the eyes of those who had seen it with their own eyes. The cubs, who had once been overlooked as too young to matter in such things, became symbols of quiet courage. Their simple act of placing food onto the human's tray grew into a story retold in every corner of the community, each retelling carrying with it the reminder that compassion could cut through division like light breaking the darkest night. What had happened was not loud or dramatic, yet it carried a power that lingered far longer than anger or cruelty ever could. The human herself carried the memory like a treasure. Whenever she sat in the mess hall after that day, she was no longer invisible. Some offered her quiet nods of respect. Others softened their gazes, and though not everyone changed, the air around her was different. She felt less like a stranger, less like an outsider forced to endure in silence. She knew it wasn't the food that had changed things, but the bond created in that moment of kindness. Loyalty had been freely given, and it was something she would never take for granted. The cubs, in their innocence, did not fully understand the depth of what they had done. To them, it had been simple. She had stood by them before, and now it was their turn to stand by her. But the older ones knew. The leaders knew. The act had been more than kindness. It had been a challenge, a shift in the way people thought about belonging, respect, and worth. The cubs had proven that barriers built by fear or pride could be broken by something as small as sharing a meal. As time passed, the story spread beyond the hall. It became part of the larger memory of the community, told to new cubs as they grew, used as a lesson in schools, shared quietly among those who struggled to find their own place. The words were always simple, but the message never lost its strength. Once loyalty is earned, it lives forever. The human's quiet endurance, the cub's bold loyalty, and the silence of that room together became a lesson that outlived the moment itself. And so, every time the human looked at the cubs, she was reminded of that bond. They had shown her that even when the world turned cold, there would always be those willing to break the silence, to offer kindness without expecting anything in return. For her, that day was not just about food or survival, it was about being seen, being defended, and knowing that her worth was not measured by her place at the table, but by the hearts that chose to stand with her. The bond was never forgotten. It grew into a memory that lived on in stories, in glances of respect, in quiet acts of kindness that followed. It reminded everyone that true strength was never found in cruelty or power, but in compassion, loyalty, and the courage to do what others would not. And though seasons changed and years passed, the story of the cubs and the human remained, alive in every heart that chose to remember what it truly meant to stand together.